So, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning, sir.
Morning, Sandeep.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning, Priti. Okay, I think first we'll briefly talk about the 9.7 part, okay? And then we'll move on to the discussion on the last test. So yesterday, we started discussing about first of all, the difference between acclimatization and the adaptability, correct? So acclimatization, do you remember? Acclimatization is a more short-term changes that we see in it. So they are mostly physiological changes or behavioral changes that we notice in us, whereas the adaptations are more permanent changes that happen in our DNA level. So eventually what happens, they can actually define the way that humans adapt to the new environment. So all concepts of evolution, natural selection, mutations, they all come into play there, correct? So as we already discussed the ideas related to that. So that is what we notice normally. And here they're asking us to, first of all, differentiate between genetic changes, non-genetic changes. Not too much of information on what genes undergo the change, but in the yesterday's examples that we briefly talked about one gene, I also mentioned about another gene in the handout that I'm going to send you. So there are definitely genetic changes that are happening. Some of them are well studied, but otherwise non-genetic changes are those that happen, physiological changes and also cultural changes or cultural adaptations are important as part of the non-genetic changes. Okay. So, and specifically, we're talking about three scenarios. One is desert, so where temperatures are really high. Another scenario is cold, so climatic conditions. And third scenario is the height, higher altitude regions. So, in these three options, that what we normally notice is we probably have an idea or understanding that we need to have what is the stress in each of those cases. Like we discussed first, high altitude stress. So what happens at high altitude stress? So mostly we focus here on the hypoxic condition, less oxygen. What happens when oxygen is less? So what type of problems we normally notice as we discussed in yesterday's class? So when oxygen levels goes down, what happens to us? What type of stress do we experience? Any one of you? So what happens when oxygen levels are low?
Hypoxia condition we feel, and unconsciousness we faint sometimes, and also weakness.
Correct. So a few things, like first of all, I think in this order. So when we go up in terms of height, we have less pressure that is built up there and less oxygen in the atmosphere. Less oxygen means we receive less oxygen into the body. When body is not receiving enough oxygen, what is the use of oxygen? Oxygen is like fuel for us. Oxygen, together with the sugars that we eat or we consume, results in energy. So if there is not enough oxygen and not enough energy output, and if there's not enough energy, it's like asking your car to run without adding fuel to it. So what happens to your body? Your body is starting to, different parts in your body starting to complain about it, including brain. So depending on how severe this is, how severe is the oxygen drop, so your body is starting to respond to it. Like mountain sickness is something that we talked about yesterday, where several different symptoms show up. But the idea here that you are deprived of energy and different tissues are actually not receiving oxygen in the blood, they're dying. So all sorts of things, eventually in the severe conditions, it may lead to death. But our body has a mechanism or a flexibility to respond to it. So that is where we talk about non-genetic and genetic. Non-genetic ones, where how do we respond to it? I gave list of those things, like we were starting to breathe more deeply, for example. right? And we also have increased blood flow or heart rate. So tachycardia takes place. So those type of responses we normally show in response to it. So people who go for hiking, they're able to manage without dying from this, right? And Sunil was mentioned a context where people, before sending them to the higher altitude regions, they're actually kept for acclimatization for some time. Your body has to get used to it. Correct, but genetic changes also happen. If people decide to live there, they moved there, so migrated there, what happens to them? So because of the enough pressure, enough need, remember what we talked about in Darwinism, so need for survival increases. So what happens because of that? Genetic changes which are advantageous to survive in those conditions, maybe changes to your respiratory system, maybe changes to your hematological system, or okay, what is that? That broke here. Okay, sorry. So the mutations that create some advantage in those people to survive in the new condition are favorable, right? Survival of the fittest, natural selection favors them. Like the genetic changes also take place, but it is very difficult to identify what exact changes have take place. We talked about one gene yesterday with respect to high altitude region studies. Okay, those type of genetic changes take place which are more permanent. So here focus more on adaptations being the more permanent changes, right? So this is what we discussed as part of the high altitude, and then we went on to discuss about the colder regions, what happens in the colder regions. And I also briefly walked you through an article where we discussed about adaptations, agriculture, and also adapting to the animals which keep us actually provide us energy sources that we require in high altitude regions, energy storage, and new practices of food storage. These seems to be the cultural adaptations with respect to high altitude regions. Okay, so like that you talk about it, and I've given a brief description on cultural adaptations as well if you have to put more emphasis on them, which I'm going to touch today. And next point is we also discussed the colder regions. Colder regions, what type of stress happens? Frost bites we talked about. What is the normal temperature of the body? And we being warm-blooded animals, how do we maintain our body temperature? We went further on discussing about the how decrease in temperature affects our body's function. Okay, and then what type of responses we show. How do we respond to it? Most importantly, we talked about vasoconstriction, and we talked about the piloerection part. We talked about behavioral changes like curling together in the process of sleeping, and also we talked about cultural adaptations, housing and clothing, right? Foods that we eat. So these are the types of things that culturally we adapted. But together, you describe how we respond to the stress factors like that. Okay, right. So the last one today we are going to discuss is the hot climates in the hot deserts, for example, the Kalahari Desert or Thar Desert. So how do people actually survive there? Because we have humans almost everywhere you can think of. Correct? They're surviving in almost every part of the world because we have that adaptability, the ability to adapt to the new environments, either temporarily or permanently, as we're talking about. So how do we respond to the higher temperatures? So in a way, this is opposite to what we talked about with respect to the cold climates. Correct? So let me first actually show you that, and then we'll talk about the cultural adaptations to this. I'm going to add a few more points, some weird behaviors that people developed socially with respect to the stress factors like that. Right, and also write suitable examples like Inuit example, people living in the northern pole side, okay, how they adapted through the housing part and the dressing part like this. So specifically talk about them. Okay, and also something that is probably important here, in addition to what we talked about, is a fat component. I think one thing you notice in terms of food habits or cultural adaptations, if you go to the polar regions, people tend to eat more fat-based food. Animal meat actually is a common source of food. Why is that? Because they have to have enough food to insulate their body. And I was also telling you yesterday, fat helps us generating more energy, more heat. So to maintain the body heat, imagine at temperatures like -20, -30, -40. Then I remember where I was doing my PhD. In winters, temperatures used to go down to -40, -42. Of course, I'm a vegetarian. I had a difficulty in surviving in those regions. But usually, people eat a lot of meat. the common food that they eat there is pork. That is part of the adaptation towards the environment. It takes enough time for them to digest the food, and also it provides enough insulation plus enough heat that they can generate by burning fat. So it's very, very important for them to have such things. And also I was briefly telling you this part that children, infants especially, have certain type of fat called brown fat or brown adipose tissue. They have specific type of fat when they are born. I was telling I think when we're discussing about the fat in the previous unit. So this is to maintain the energy requirements, and also when they came out of the womb, mother's womb, which was more warmer. So for them, fat actually helps. So initial stages, this fat is natural adaptation process. They have it in their body, right? Of course, unless they're malnourished. So this is also a way that we are adapting to our new conditions. So also we talked about Inuit populations, how they deal with cultural adaptations like housing, clothing, plus physiological changes and biological changes. So we discussed this aspect together. This is not a very complex topic. Here, core idea and examples are important. So it's easier. And as I was telling you, questions are regularly coming from this part, mostly asking about how do you respond. Okay, so this is the idea about cold response, and what do we do in the heat? So in the desert areas, how do we respond to it? Okay, I'm also going to give you, I think I have two additional resources with me on this. One Stein and Rove discussion on this, and second is Ember and Ember. I'm going to send you one of these additional document, okay, for you to read. So, and I also made a summary on few aspects that are more important in the exam point of view that I'm going to show you. But before getting into that, I would like to you to just focus on the heat part. So what happens in the desert regions? Opposite to the cold, we start seeing that there's so much of external change in the temperature. So body has to cope up with it. So our body's core temperature, as I was telling you, if it has to be 36.9 and 37 degrees centigrade. But what happens sometimes, because our body is not able to maintain this much because external temperature is so high. So your core body temperature can reach up to 41 degrees centigrade, which is a very, very serious condition, right? Where we start losing the fluid. We start losing the fluid from the body. And what happens ultimately, it leads to the coagulation of the blood. Our blood actually coagulates and doesn't flow, resulting in death of various tissues, including the brain tissue. So that we lose the control or regulation on various physiological activities on the body. So too much of dehydration takes place. We lose body fluids, and the fluidity is the one of the core idea of our body functions, because we supply everything with the blood. What happens if blood doesn't move? So you're not receiving any supply at all. But opposite scenario, in the cold, it is frostbite or the freezing conditions that kill us. Here, it's too much of heat that pulls out the fluid from the body because of natural mechanism of how body works. So we cannot handle that so much. That is why when temperature goes much higher, of course 103, 104 degrees we talk about, our body can handle up to 103, fine. But 104, 105 degrees Fahrenheit, that is where we actually our body starting to give up. And the small children, we hear that they develop fits in these conditions because the nervous system is undergoing damage here. So heat stroke is very bad. And of course, as soon as you are exposed to a little bit of heat, in summers, some regions in India also, we experience temperatures that go beyond, in Hyderabad, we get about 43, 44 degrees centigrade. There are places where we get about 49, 50 degrees centigrade in India, right? So which is very difficult for a body to cope up. But it is temporary. It's only is there for a few months for us. So what do? We actually try to minimize the effect by regulating our activity at certain durations, certain time points, and cultural adaptations, the type of dresses we wear, the types of homes we build. So a lot of cultural adaptations can be seen here. But what about people who constantly experience it, people who are more closer to the equator? What type of responses they show here? Okay, is what we need to learn here. Okay. So heat responses are kind of opposite to what we discussed with respect to cold responses yesterday. So vasoconstriction is what we have seen with the cold response. Here it is vasodilation. So what is vasodilation? So increased blood flow. So to the peripheral parts, because blood flow has a function of releasing heat, excess heat from the body. So what happens? We start increasing the blood flow to the external parts of the body. In the cold conditions, what did we talk about? The vital organs receive the blood, but to the periphery we stop or we reduce the flow of blood. But here opposite is true. We start sending more blood flow. That is what I was telling you yesterday. You stand in the hot sun. What happens? You become red. Why is that? Because you're starting to send more blood. And what happens when blood is traveling through the blood vessels at a higher rate? What happens? More heat is generated. More heat is released. Like that, vasodilation is a common process, and along with that, sweat. We sweat so much. The purpose of sweating is to release the amount of heat that you are accumulating in the body, so that average temperature in your body is maintained. So increase blood flow to the surface of the body, allowing the heat from the core of the body to be released to the environment. And the most important response is sweating. We sweat. So it's a primary mechanism of removing heat from the body is sweating. But looks like, interestingly, sweat glands, because we have sweat glands, we have kind of pores and glands to produce sweat, right? Interestingly, as far as the studies are concerned, so doesn't matter where you are living, looks like the number of sweat glands that we have is more or less constant. So the number of sweat glands is not much, but the output of them seems to be different. So for example, that Cynthia Bial's and other colleagues study in 2000 showed that there is evaporation of 1 liter of sweat. When you release about a liter of sweat, it removes 560 kilocalories of heat. Significant amount of heat is released per unit volume. It is about a liter of that. And in extreme conditions, we can sweat up to 4 liters an hour. Imagine what happens. It's like you're taking bath. Some people do have that, right? That they normally get wet, and when they're exposed to heat like that. Okay. So what are the responses that we normally see? I think the famous response that people notice, that which we are going to briefly talk about in the concept of race and racism, is a skin coloration or skin pigmentation. Skin coloration or skin pigmentation. Okay. So you notice that actually related to this, there's something called Glogger's rule. Glogger's rule. I'll type here. Glogger's rule. As we learned about Bergman's rule and Allen's rule, in a similar manner, there's something called a Glogger's rule. So what Glogger actually identified, that the populations of birds and mammals which live in the warmer climates, they produce more melanin pigmentation. Their skin is more darker. Okay, so those that live in the warmer climates, they produce more melanin. Melanin is a pigment that actually defines the color of our skin. We talked about this in the quantitative characteristics or polygenic characteristics, correct? In Mendelian inheritance part 9.2. So as per that, we definitely see that we have more and more melanin is produced as we move towards the warmer climates or towards the equator. That is why our coloration, we are more brown, not because we are born with that race quality, but our environment where we live. I think that is where understanding the biological component is very important in solving or addressing racism. Correct. So we have certain skin, certain type of skin, we produce certain amount of melanin because the environment that we live in. If you go to the African part, the place which are more closer to the equator, so they are more dark, they have more darker skin. This is a biological mechanism to protect them. So this comes under what is called Glauber's rule. So warmer climates, so they produce more melanin and our skin gets more darker. So there's a direct correlation between the environment that we live, the temperature that we expose to, the heat that we expose to, and how dark is our skin. Correct. So directly in relationship with the sunlight, melanin gets produced exponentially in a way, and then thereby protecting us from that harmful UV rays or UV radiations that we receive from the sun. Okay. So some of the components we talked about: vasodilation, sweating, and also pylorelaxation, as opposed to the piloerection in colder regions where hairs stand up because of muscular movements around there. Okay, in a way, pylorelaxation opposite to that is true. And also in normally as a behavioral response, we curl up in response to the cold climates. And here we stretch out by opening up. The body was provide larger surface area because normally the moisture gets trapped, the sweat gets trapped. So what happens? You prefer to have the surface area getting exposed. So these are some of the responses that we normally notice in hot climates. Physiologically, we're talking about and behaviorally. And also towards this, we add cultural adaptations. So what type of cultural adaptations we notice? So what type of cultural changes that we normally notice here, cultural adaptations we notice here? So again, of course, clothing is important. Otherwise, we discussed the Bergman rule and also Allen's rule with respect to this yesterday. So where body surface, so people who are in the hot climates, they tend to be longer and they tend to have a larger surface area. They are less stocky compared to people living in the polar regions. You also explained that biological adaptation. So where our people living towards the equator tends to have higher surface area, tend to be lean. Okay, like you see in few populations that I'm going to talk to you about. So these ones, plus what do we notice in addition to that? So appendages. Allen's rule also holds to some extent here. The appendages like legs, limbs are actually longer, again resulting in more surface area, so more sweat can be lost, less heat is retained. Plus culturally, clothing, loose clothing. So in African regions, some tribes you see the way they actually dress, they have loose clothing. Okay, so enough protection, but it allows the heat loss. And we know that excuse me, nowadays the type of clothing that we adapt to, like cotton clothing for example, thin layers of clothing that provides enough aeration, ventilation to the body but doesn't absorb enough heat. like white clothing, the color of the clothing. Over a period of time, we also understood the importance of that. So we see that the way we dress in the summers is slightly different. Okay, that is cultural adaptation. So after realizing that, the type of environment that we are living in and what is best suits in terms of dressing. The next one is the housing. So the way houses are designed, the mainly to reduce the heat, trapping of heat, they actually repel enough heat away from the home. They're designed like that with enough ventilation. Especially you notice that the houses that actually increase the evaporation part, which are made up of adobes. In deserts, they are called adobes. They are made up of the clay and the type of material where it doesn't absorb the heat enough. It actually keeps cooler inside by reflecting enough heat, by evaporating enough heat. So in tropics, we normally notice that, and also open shelters with enough ventilation. Open shelters are also very, very common. The type of housing that you normally notice in deserts is called adobes. Okay, so the houses are designed in such a way that less heat is trapped and more heat is actually expelled. With enough ventilation, open shelters is also a common theme. In India, I think this is because we don't experience as much as heat as they do in African regions or desert regions. So here we actually have more open house concepts. And also olden days, we have seen more of houses built with the um, clay. But nowadays, what are we noticing? I think concrete more or less took over. So this is where I think lack of understanding. Psychological anthropology teaches us how cultural adaptations are making it possible for us to survive in a given environment. But unfortunately, sometimes it is mistook. So culturally, what we are doing now, we are going with the ease, we are going with the comfort in building homes. Now, concrete houses are making it so difficult for us to survive in them because this environment doesn't suit very well to the concrete houses. They keep it really, make it really cooler when it is colder, and also very hot in the summers. So I think that's very important to inculcate the knowledge that we gain through cultural understandings of why certain houses are built in certain ways. But unfortunately, technology sometimes provides us not much options. Okay, so
Looking at this from a different way,
mm,
we are looking at, say, how they used to build these houses,
mm,
and this is cultural adaptation.
mm.
But going few years in the future, if they look at us, would the air conditioning be viewed as a cultural adaptation?
Unsustainable cultural adaptation, I must say. I think it's the problem now. What happened is, I think less and less focus is put on the sustainability. So our focus is this innovation. You found a new tool that you can actually put ACs, coolers, which can temporarily help you. But sustainability is a big question. Pollution has increased. We need more energy demand. So indirectly, we are increasing more heat. Overall outcome is actually very different. And this is also holds true not just for us. Even if you go to the colder climates, heaters are a very common theme there. And enough energy are spent. Most of their bills, current bills, are because of the heating process. So it is very unsustainable. I think that is why we need to have a better understanding about why people have culturally adapted to that, which is actually, doesn't cause enough harm to the environment. At the same time, you're not increasing the energy output or need for energy output or energy demand, and it's more sustainable. But that component is missing. In a way, technologically, I agree that it is one way of adapting to the environment. But imagine what happens in the concrete homes you put the ACs without much ventilation. So I think for realizing it is going to take some time. Already we are realizing it now, but very few people are adapting to it. Nowadays we talk about eco-friendly homes, where we have enough ventilation. But the problem is we are like in my village, we have houses like that, which are built with those adobes. But the thing is, we don't have people who can repair it. So we are out of choice to maintain those homes. Correct. So slowly adapting it. So I think it's very important for us to inculcate the ideas that we learn in anthropological concepts of observing cultures for a long durations, why and how they adapted to it. But I think there's not too much of emphasis on this, unfortunately. But you're absolutely right. The way we are going ahead is, in a way, a technological intervention to survive in the climates like this, but not sustainable at all. So I provided some summary on these type of things, and I'm also going to talk about a bit of weird behavior you see in some cultures with respect to adaptations like this. Just wanted to show you an article which I don't see here. So look at this information here. So I'm showing you the handout that I'm going to share with you. So cultural adaptations, I've given a brief idea on cultural adaptation. You might have studied about Franz Boas, right, in social cultural part. So he's the one who actually put little emphasis on how human beings actually adapted culturally to certain climates like that. Okay, so this theoretical background related that comes from the Franz Boas work. So either here you see that culturally how we learn things. Culturally, we learn few things, we figure out few things. We also talk about in the primates and fossil behavior that those are passed on to the future generations. What people have learned with their experiences in the process of adapting to the new environments culturally. So thereby what happens, we notice that people's perceptions related to external environment is actually taken differently by different cultures. So to the same environment, maybe different cultures adapt differently. But this idea of how we adapt to it is inherited over a period of time to people, which may also eventually influence, even our genetics can be influenced by our cultural adaptations eventually over a period of time. Okay, so and of course, but culture is not genetically determined. What we do in terms of culture may not be determined genetically, and the human predisposition to assimilate culture and function is influenced by the biological factors, right? So but to have those cultural behavior is influenced by our biological need. So culture may not be defined by our genes, but our biological needs define what we eat, what we wear, where do we live. So cultural adaptations are definitely defined by biological factors. And our studies on humans for a long period of time that they understood that we humans are actually product of both biological as well as cultural events. So what we are today is because of both the biological events as well as the cultural events or adaptations in the new environment. So that is why I think when you're studying human variation, I think understanding the biocultural adaptation also is a key. Otherwise, it becomes incomplete. If you focus either just on the biological variation or you just focus on the cultural variation, I think it is not sufficient. It won't give us the complete picture. That is where physical anthropology, in anthropology, the physical and biological part plays an important role, because unless you integrate this biological component, the picture that we are seeing is not complete. So we have to understand the human evolution, understand the human culture with respect to our biological adaptation to the needs that we have, special needs that we have. Maybe in this particular chapter, ecological needs that we are talking about. They are met through both biological and cultural responses. Okay, so we have to integrate it together and look into that. The scale of cultural changes depends on multiple factors. So then they vary from sometimes culture to culture. So they may be the productive and procurement activity. So the type of activity that we have in a given atmosphere, in a given environment, the way we live life, the mode of life, the way we live, the dwellings, the houses that we build, and settlements, how people actually settle. Do they live in groups or do they live individually from each other? And the patterns that we are going to talk about sometimes in cultural adaptation, people sleeping in groups is commonly seen in colder climates. Okay, and the exchange systems, the type of exchanges that they have, whether with respect to the food and animals, etc., and the clothing. So all these are part of the cultural adaptations into the given environment. So overall, I think we see that our cultural system that includes social, ethnic, psychological, ideological components together with the biological components is an integral part of this adaptation. Okay, so in hot climate specifically, I think I was already talking to you about this. How we adjust to the given environment is housing is very, very important. And we also focus on one, the way we build the houses with the enough evaporative loss. Clothing, housing helps in handling this process. So the microculture, the tiny steps that we take as part of the culture helps us dealing with the stressful environment or the macro environment better. as per the studies that have been happening for decades now. Okay, and habitations and clothing that we talked about also provides us favorable climate, microclimate, so that we can behaviorally adjust and culturally adjust to avoid the stress that we may expose to in these climatic conditions. Okay, houses are constructed with high heat capacity materials such as adobe and stone, and also they have a method of designing in such a way that heat is entered late, so it gets cooled down in the process. And the materials that absorb large amount of heat before entering, pushing the heat into the interior part, so our external part is actually covered like that. So it's a very common practice in terms of designing or engineering that happens in housing. And also one thing that you notice in the deserts is two-way problem that they experience here. In deserts, they not only experience of too much of heat in the daytime, they also experience of too much cooler conditions in the night. They also have to be culturally prepared, or prepared in terms of housing. So what happens, I think they have to make sure that the temperature is lost through radiation and convection process. So there is enough ventilation that it is lost, it is not trapped. Otherwise, the heat can be felt throughout the day, and suddenly in the mid of the night, it may become too cooler. So we have to have houses designed dual, keeping these dual needs in the desert areas. Okay, so I've given some examples here. So like Pueblo Indians and Middle Eastern communities, the way they construct the house several meters beneath the surfaces of the mean temperature, because underneath the soil, the temperatures are a bit cooler. So they tend to actually dig a bit deeper and build houses like that in few communities. These are also cultural adaptations you normally see. Okay, and also compact geometry. Sometimes what we notice, in some cases we actually prefers the open housing or open shelters, but some areas we notice that compact geometry in building houses to minimize the surface area with respect to the internal volume. Thereby what happens, the heat trap is reduced. So culturally people may adapt differently, where some areas you notice the open houses with open shelters, and some areas where we have more compact geometry where less amount of heat gets exposed to the surface area, hence less heat gets trapped. So especially these are very useful in the desert regions in order to uh, give out the heat to the desert winds. Okay, so also I was telling you the clothing part. So type of material they normally choose, which actually reduces the abrasions on the body, and sunburns. It is also important that we prevent the sunburn. We cannot just have no clothing, right? So we have to even prevent the sunburn for that. And also reduce the solar heat gain, how much we trap the heat. It's very important. So certain clothing materials that are normally adapted ensures this type of features, and also reduces the level of perspiration required to maintain the equilibrium. At the same time, we have to have enough perspiration so that the equilibrium of the fluid in the body is maintained and the heat equilibrium is also maintained very well. So also people who acclimatize, well acclimatized the individuals, they wear clothes that perspire 30% less than the unclothed men. So enough perspiration and sweating that is normally seen. So 30% compared to the unclothed men who lose it, because it's very important not only handle the heat but also the fluid levels in the body. So the clothing has to prevent the sunburn and the UV radiation, and second also allow enough perspiration or sweating. So but you have to find a fine balance here. So people who are well adapted to that, they actually wear clothes perspire 30% less than the people who don't, or who prefer to have unclothed version of it. So it's very, very important. Okay, so thereby reducing the heat load as per the studies published very long ago, about 165 kilocalories per hour. Okay. And people who are Chamba Arabs and tribal populations of Sahara Desert, they also wear clothing that minimizes the conductive and radiant heat, because the different forms of heat loss. So it's very important that one conductive heat is where through contact that heat losses happens. And the radiant heat is where actually it is able to return or reflect back. So clothing should be in such a way that it is happening, that you are actually radiating the heat back. Okay, and the heat is lost because of the contact. So what happens here, you don't retain too much of heat. So such cultural adaptations are noticed in few regions of the world, especially people living in the desert areas. Okay, So right. So and the loose clothes and the baggy clothing that you see in the African regions, the way they wear clothes allows enough ventilation. Okay. So you notice that these type of cultural adaptations are common in response to the heat stress. Okay. Also, I've mentioned those topics we were discussing yesterday, with respect to the cultural adaptations in climates, colder climates. I talked briefly about the Eskimos. Eskimos, those live in the North American part. Okay, so they have houses that we were talking about, igloos, houses built with igloos. I was explaining that to you, how the igloos are actually built, which is an insulating material. And I was also telling you that they actually have a flame that is placed slightly beneath the level of the house in such a way that the cold air coming inside is warmed up. So such cultural adaptations in terms of one housing, plus also the way they allow the ventilation of the warm air is also noticeable in the colder climates. They place a source of heat, usually an oil or blubber or coal lamp it is called, at a lower level than the main floor, whereby cold air is warmed before reaching the area where people live. So this is also a practice that you normally notice. And the structure of the houses also permits trapping of air, which in turn further provides insulation. So you have the insulating material like ice. On top of that, bit of air that is trapped inside, which is also acting like an insulating material. Okay. So they notice that they can maintain temperatures about 10 degrees to 21 degrees in these houses. Imagine how this is possible with the sources that are there already in nature. Like they're using snow basically or ice here and building houses. Okay. Also clothing. Clothing that they use a specific type of skin. Animal skin is very important, especially caribous. The caribou animals that are common in the colder climates, they actually use a clothing made up of this. Like I was showing you the image yesterday, how Eskimos Inuit people actually wear clothes. So this gives them enough insulation compared to the skin that is made up of the clothes that are made up of seal skin. Compared to them, caribou skin provides enough insulation. The fur of caribou seems to be 1.5 and 3-inch thickness and provides enough insulation. There are certain units for that called CLO units, 7 to 12 CLO units it seems to provide them. Plus, Eskimos wear snowshoes and short skin mittens. But the thing is, they also have enough activities, fishing. So, and those times they actually have to expose their body parts. Okay. So, which can provide or produce a cold stress. Biological adaptations will help. Like a vasoconstriction part would greatly help in this type of scenario. So, together with the cultural adaptation and the biological adaptations, that they are able to survive effectively in these regions. Okay. So, I provided some of the information that you require here. I've also briefly discussed about the population living in the even high altitude regions experience the cold. So they have combinations of high altitude stress and cold stress. How they adapted to these cold adaptations, I've briefly talked about some populations living in Andes. Okay, in terms of diet that they eat and also the type of agriculture we talked about already and the clothing. So that is very important to understand here. Also briefly talked about permanent houses like adobe houses, bricks made up of soil and water, organic material, how they are able to maintain temperatures very well in the high altitude regions is also important. And also houses that are built with stones and roofed with straw. So straw is also sometimes used as a material that we normally don't use in some houses. Okay, so sometimes it is very difficult if temperature goes much beyond than that. But overall, we see diversity in cultural adaptations in different parts of the world in response to heat stress and also high altitude stress. So these are some ideas that I have written here. So with examples, go through them. So together with what we discussed, what I showed in the slides, plus this information should help you provide enough information on cultural as well as the biological adaptation. And one thing I wanted to add here is the social response to harsh environment. This is also something really interesting that I found out, how people socially respond to harsh environments. Certain behavior that we notice here, really peculiar behavior. So it looks like people in Eskimos who have to live and survive in the extremely harsh environments, where you notice that or not only the climate but also the sources for food is also limited in these climates. Hunting in these times when temperatures are below 35-40 degrees centigrade is very, very difficult. Then how do they adapt socially? So as per the anthropologist Knud Rasmussen, normally people from Norwegian countries have this last names, Rasmussen, Knud Rasmussen. So he went to King William Island. He went to King William Island, the area where Eskimos normally live. He noticed that several marriages, and he found out that sample of 18 marriages, there were 96 female infants, but 38 out of 96 female infants were killed. Okay, so about 30%, more than 30% of examples that he studied, female infants were actually killed. Why is that? What was the reason behind it? So this is a strategy of female infanticide, and this is practiced by Netsilik Eskimos. So why? This is to increase the ratio of males to females. Why is that? Is that actually, now if you see in the social context, now we see that this is actually extremely bad. This is kind of a discrimination against females, correct? But what is the social aspect or the cultural aspect to this? So here, the balance between the sexes of females and males reduces the stress factor on the male hunters, because hunters are usually males, right? So what happens if you have fewer males who cannot support the livelihood of the remaining people? Ultimately, they may die. So culturally, what do? They understand the burden on the given society. What do? They decide to put these females to death, female infants to death, because they want more and more male hunters to support the families. So this is one reason. One, to increase the number of males who can hunt. This is one. The second reason here is females are considered to have less survivability than males. The understanding is that females survive less in these colder climates. So they said people who cannot survive more, I think there is no point in supporting their survival through the food by procuring enough materials for them. So hence they practice suicide. Sometimes they practice suicide, they practice invalidicide. People who are sick, disabled, they kill them because they become burden to them, right? So this is called invalidicide. So people who are invalid are people who are actually disabled, cannot support or contribute to the given society. So even killing them is common in some cultures. So suicides, invalidicides, and senilicides are killing elderly people. There is theory that we are going to talk about in aging. Social theories of aging we are going to discuss about. In some cultures, they practice killing elderly people, but it's debatable. Elderly brings experiences to us, but they don't contribute directly much to the society. So what is right? So infanticides usually as an extreme response to extreme conditions, although it has been practiced in wide variety of human societies, but this is rarely seen, but it is observed in few societies, as we see, as revealed by Knud Rasmussen. But overall, this concepts of socio-cultural flexibility seems to provide the certain steps towards handling the stress factors in a given environment. So this is one extreme step that they take socially to harsh environments that worth to mention. So this is part of handout. I'm going to send you that. But key points are highlighted here. Make a note of them. But as description wise, this handout is useful to you. But if you want to describe and briefly choose the right points for writing them in the exam, so I think the key points I've given here should be sufficient. I'll see if I can give you some reading on this. Ember seems to connect very well with the culture as the biological parts here. So I'm going to provide you that. I'm going to probably take a scan or pictures of it and post it. Also, I briefly talked about, if you get a question on, we'll discuss about genetic and non-genetic factors we're talking about, right? So non-genetic factors so far we talked about. So genetic factors also we discussed in yesterday's class. I've given a brief explanation on how nose shape, physiological features of how nose changes in some people, which has to be genetic. And we talked about in cold climates how narrow noses and long noses are useful to us. So these you can mention. And also high altitude regions, I was mentioning to you about the EPAS1 gene, mutations in EPAS1 gene, especially in the Tibetans, how this is useful. Also, I briefly mentioned about a gene called EGLN1. If you can remember, write about both of these. The only genes that I found in literature respect to genetic changes that happen. EGLN1 also decreases the hemoglobin production when oxygen is plentiful. Okay, but Tibetans and Andeans, we talked about, there's a different patterns, right? So some of the patterns that you notice is because of mutations that happen in the genetic. So certain genetic changes have happened in the process of adapting differently to the high altitude climates. So those genes I've explained briefly here. Okay, I've also provided this discussion we already done yesterday. Do Bergman's and Allen's rule hold true for humans today? If you get a question like that, what do you write? I've given a brief idea. Also mentioned what references I've used for this description. Okay, and also I remember noticing that, give me just 1 second, I wanted to show you one last point that I wanted to be aware about on this. And then when stop the class, we start discussing the test. So this is something I remember seeing in one of the exam. So aerobic fitness, sometimes, people from certain climates can do better in certain sports. People from the high altitude regions, you notice that they are better athletes. Okay, so also look into the connection like this. So why certain people from certain regions actually have advantage in some sports? Because how their body adapted to certain climates. Either it is heat, like let's say that there is Olympic games that are happening in the hotter climates. I think people have to be trained differently to perform well in those regions. And humans have understood over a period of time the importance of ecological anthropology and its application. Okay, I think once a question came on this component, so I'm going to give you a bit of insight on what to write if your questions actually come on these aspects. So yes, I think most of the questions that we already discussed, I'll briefly mention about the questions that have come in the past. Do Allen's rule and Bergman's rule hold for human populations? Explain with examples that we already discussed yesterday. Discuss the genetic and non-genetic factors in the biocultural adaptations of human beings to different environments. Again, so we talked about cultural, so there are non-genetic factors and genetic factors. We talked about physiological responses like no shape, and also adaptations to high altitude stresses we talked about as genetic factors. Sometimes I briefly asked about ecological anthropology. Short note on ecological anthropology. What do you do? What is ecological anthropology? We talked about the brief idea about ecological anthropology yesterday. What is the importance of it and what do we study in this? So you have to emphasize when the short note is asked, instead of just talking about responses to various climates, talk about the introduction, give introduction to the ecological anthropology, what comes under, what is the scope of ecological anthropology. There explain the examples, how we focus on both cultural and physiological and cultural and biological adaptations with respect to that. How is that useful? How is this understanding is useful? You can talk about either building houses, planning things as per the climate change that is happening today for better preparedness, and also performing well in the sports. So these are some significant components that you need to write with respect to ecological anthropology part. Okay, and what questions have come? What are the stresses at high altitude? How do better cardiorespiratory functions help the native islanders in combating low environmental pressures? So what are they asking about? What stress factors happen in high altitude? Briefly explain it. How better cardiorespiratory functions? Didn't we talk about that? Hematological route, respiratory route. So give those examples. They're talking about how better cardio, heart function, and respiratory function can help. Give the examples of what we discussed yesterday in yesterday's class. Okay, so that's a straightforward question from what we discussed yesterday. And native highlanders are well adapted to high altitude environment. Discuss. So what are the adaptations that you normally see in the highlanders living in the high altitude conditions? Discuss those that we discussed in we had a discussion on yesterday's class. Then the one question that I wanted to focus here is, how does improved aerobic fitness increase exercise tolerance in warm, humid climates? What are they asking here? How does improved aerobic fitness increase exercise tolerance in warm, humid climates? How are people trained to perform better, to handle the warmth better, temperatures better? Give suitable examples to support your answer. Okay, for that, I'm going to show you. I'm going to share this with you as well. I've collected a brief idea from various articles on this, on improved aerobic fitness and exercise tolerance in warm, humid climates. So first you discuss what are the different types of stress warm, humid climates actually cause. In this, so normally if people actually have to work out in warm, hot conditions, what happens? Body temperature gets elevated because you're burning your fat, you're burning calories. Heat gets generated. And also it creates enough cardiovascular strain, enough pressure on your strain on your heart in pumping the blood. And also metabolic activities gets altered. So thereby what happens? You get thermally discomfort. Okay, and also our aerobic performance decreases because you are experiencing now heat stress and you're doing workout, you're practicing for, let's say, for a game. Then what happens? The amount of heat that gets generated kind of affects your performance. So you have to somehow find a balance and somehow train your body to do well. So here, I think first part we already discussed vasodilation part. You talk about how blood is actually sent away from the key parts, how much you sweat, losing the fluids. Okay, so thereby reducing the overall blood volume and put additional demand for heart. Fluid loss happens, so can make it more strainful for the heart. And if it is actually more humid outside, if you are living in the humid climates, it makes it a bit more worse. So why? Because your sweat doesn't evaporate very much in those climates. So what happens? Your body temperature keeps increasing. So it's very important to keep in mind these aspects. So when people actually keep working out on these climates, what happens? Exercise associated collapse happens. People may feel lightheadedness and they faint. If people are not trained, let's say you're talking about North Americans, for example, Europeans, they brought to have Olympic Games in Africa. What happens to them? They may actually become exhausted very soon and they may even faint because their body is not adapted to that. And heat exhaustion, when your body temperature rises above 104 degrees, I was already talking to you about Fahrenheit. So people may experience nausea, vomiting, weakness, and headaches. Those type of heat exhaustion symptoms can also be seen. And eventually people may even experience heat stroke that is common in India and certain regions of India. So people may die out of loss of fluid and because of heat strokes. So these are the problems that you may experience if you are not trained enough to practice or perform in the hot climates. And this seems to be also the varying effect. This seems to have a varying effect on different age groups as well. Youngsters seems to have higher risk because they have more surface area, and because of physical activity, seems like youngsters can be more affected than the elderly people. Also, the amount of sweat that they produce seems to be comparatively less compared to the adults, as per few studies. So what we need to do? So we have to acclimatize to this. We have to train ourselves to handle this better. Okay, so lower heart rate, core temperature handling, and higher sweat rate. So these are some responses that we normally create. Handling the heart rate, even lower heart rate to handle the situation sometimes, because more settled heart rate seen in some people. Core temperature is well maintained, doesn't matter what is the outside temperature when you're properly trained. And also higher sweat rate during exercise. So amount of heat that is building up is actually lost. So this is very, very important, I think, responses that we produce. And we have to train our body to get used to it. So you have to expose to these conditions during the training process, basically. And what about the role of aerobic fitness in this process? So scientists actually do research on this. The specific scientists focus actually have, where they focus on understanding the heat acclimatization strategies, especially for occupational people who are the professional runners or athletes, also for militaries. When they are trained using this type of ecological anthropology knowledge. Okay. So evidences clearly show that people who live and train over many weeks in the heat, they might be able to tolerate higher maximal core temperatures. Although those people are trained, let's say in Americas, for example, or European countries, they have to get trained in the heat climates so that, what happens, their tolerance towards the maximum heat retainment in the body is better. The body gets used to it. So these components are incorporated during the training process for athletes who are preparing for performing in the temperatures that are very different, especially in the hot climates. So successful hot weather athletes, they're able to tolerate these conditions better, especially the higher core temperatures better. And they have worked on several different things, like how long do they actually work on it so that their body doesn't get exhausted, but slowly getting acclimatized. Scientists have, researchers have worked on the specifics on this. After only for about 30 to 45 minutes of sessions of intermittent exercise in 30 degrees centigrade with 27% of relative humidity, the 17 well-trained female athletes showed a lower core temperature and also rise in thermal comfort, which resulted in the overall exercise capacity. So from an article I've picked up, how long they have to train so that their body gets acclimatized but not too stressed out. So studies show that one particular study talks about training for 30 to 45 minutes with gaps, with breaks in between, in 30 degrees centigrade with 27% of humidity. So the number of people they observed here is 17. They actually could manage their overall core temperature very well. So they can perform better when they are trained at 30 degrees centigrade, because average temperatures there is 15 degrees or so. So 30 degrees is the best for them. But you cannot keep stretching them, otherwise what happens, their body may collapse. So this is how they heat acclimatize their bodies during the training process. Okay, and similarly, I think be aware that people who live on the high altitude stresses, they are naturally adapted to the conditions of low oxygen. So what happens there when you are running, where your body temporarily experiences that low oxygen levels, what happens there? Your body able to cope up because you're able to take the deep breath, or you have higher hemoglobin concentrations or more amount of RBC, you're able to handle it better. So people from high altitude regions have advantage in performing well as athletes. So like that, there is definitely an advantage of our body's adaptation, biocultural, also not biocultural, biological and physiological adaptation. So be aware, because sometimes they're also asking in this context. So know the connection here. I'm going to send you this summary that I made on this. So read it, and especially in understanding how people have to be trained differently if they have to perform in more hot climates, hot and humid climates. Okay. Right. So this is what I wanted to talk to you as part of the 9.7 ecological anthropology part. So I'm going to share today the handouts I was showing you, the information I was showing you, and also additional reading material plus this additional component. I might put this together with the other article. Okay. Right. Any questions, guys, before we move on to the test discussion part? Are you able to understand the overall theme and idea about this chapter? What is ecological anthropology? What are our responses? What needs to be written? Questions are more or less straightforward, except for this type of applications from ecological anthropology. Any questions? Anything that you found difficult? You're good? Even if at a later point of time, if you come across this, go through it. As I was already telling you, when I'm going to send you that today, I'm going to send you about an hour or so. Read it. When the ideas are fresh, finish reading it. And wherever you have issues, underline it and make a note of it. So that will save a lot of your time. Okay, right. So the test part. Okay, first of all, yes, I think we have seen the questions from the unit 1.4. So evaluate the theories and those terms related to that. And we also wrote answers on population genetics part. Okay. So don't worry. I think don't focus too much on the marks you got here. Okay. First of all, I would like to tell you here that if I have to match how marks are normally given, I have seen that about 50% maximum marks are given to the students. So I was following the same trend here. So for 100-mark questions, our cutoff is about 50. This is to just give the numbers that in the exam. Otherwise, I would have preferred giving you about 60, 75 marks if it is my original evaluation for that. But I kept to decide to keep in line with what is normally given in the exam in terms of marks. So I kept to the about 60% is all right, but I kept to about 50 to 55% marks. Okay, so the marks are adjusted to what normally seen. So keep that in mind. It's not just about your performance. Okay, so we were expecting a maximum about 50 to 55 marks in this exam. So depending on that, you rate how you performed. And second thing is, it's not about a performance here, but about realizing what mistakes you have done. So I'm going to generally talk about the structure of the answers, and I'm also going to show you, like basically, I don't want to compare here, but want to give a picture to others, like what answers to refer to and what answers are actually better in terms of presentation, in terms of content. I'm going to point out about few of your answers on that. But again, my intention here is not to highlight someone or compare someone here, but quality of work. What type of answers, what type of content, what type of organization is important. This is for should be learning experience for all of us. So don't try to compare in terms of marks or performance. Focus on where you went wrong, what mistakes you have done. So that's how you should focus on improvising your performance in the next test. Okay, so that should be the idea here. So I'm going to show you the papers as well, and I made a brief summary on what should come in each of these parts. Okay, so starting with the, I think first 5 questions, 10 marker questions that I've given you, starting with the Lamarckism. Lamarckism, the idea here with the Lamarckism is first to provide briefly what is Lamarckism. Okay, what is Lamarck theory, explain who is Lamarck and the book he published. I think this type of factual data is important for this type of questions. When did he present his work and what is his main theme? Then you go with the key points. Once you provide this introduction, basic introduction to the Lamarckism concept, and provide the key points of his theory. Okay, so the 4 points that most of you have mentioned that talk about those 4 ideas. Either you use, I think, preferably the flowchart idea. Some of you have not given the flowchart, but prefer giving the flowchart because it provides a better picture. But you don't have to necessarily use a flowchart. You can also talk about those 4 points and explain those 4 points is enough. But one problem I have seen in students is they mentioned these points twice. They listed them as part of the key points and they described them separately, because it's very important that you use the space that is given to you effectively. Redundancy should be avoided. In many of your answers, I've seen that people do repeat the same information. It doesn't add too much of value to it. So avoid those repetitions. I've mentioned wherever you have repeated it, I've mentioned in a comment that avoid this repetition. So make sure that you avoid those type of things and you are using the space for explaining things that are matching the demand of the question. So the answer structure should be somewhat like this. Provide the brief intro to it about the Lamarck and what is the key idea behind Lamarckian theory, what are the key points of it, and explain it with examples. It's very important to give examples for these type of things. Giraffe's example is the most standard one, but pick up, I've given, I think, part of the IGNOS material, there are many examples. Okay, but the key example is giraffe's example. And how much to write on that? I've seen the students, some of you have nicely described it, but the thing is you started expanding it too much. Like for example, you can draw a diagram where there is a difference that can be noticed in the inheritance of the acquired characteristics concept with respect to giraffes. So show it an image if you want briefly. I've seen that you attempted to draw images. It will get better. Don't worry. I think you have creating idea on this. Okay, it's very important that you draw diagrams, use flowcharts where necessary. Okay, and then towards the end, don't focus too much on, because it's a short note. You don't have too much of space for writing, focusing on shortcomings. The majority of the focus should be on these 3 parts, mainly on the theory, his theory, explaining his theory with example. And mention the shortcomings, but you don't have to expand more on the shortcomings. I think one of your answers, I think Sunil, the approach that you took in writing your answer, you gave a point and you gave the shortcoming of that. So we are not discussing critically. If the question is asking for critical comparison, yes, I think your approach should be valid. But here, I think you lose the essence of presenting information when you do that approach. So preferably, I want you to focus on something like this. Explain briefly what it is, describe the key points with the flowchart and the key points, and then shortcomings towards the end, rather than critically analyzing each point simultaneously. Okay, my preference is actually going with that type of information. And I feel that both Vishal as well as Preeti had done well in terms of presenting this information. Look at their papers, how the structure of the information is. But it's mixed because I've seen many others also have written some other answers well. But overall, I will show you that because I've also done a comparative evaluation when I have done how these things are. Like if you see the Preeti's paper, Preeti have organized information well, I think clearly standing out in terms of how the organization in terms of paragraphs is. Okay, so this is definitely preferable. So what you have done, like I clearly see that you explained what is Lamarckism, inheritance of acquired characteristics. One thing I would have seen here, preferred to see here is his published work is published. Okay, that could be something that you can add here. And salient features of the Lamarck concept, you mentioned briefly the 4 points, clearly visible. To the examiner, the answer structure is visible to them. So this type of structure really helps because you are even before the examiner looks into your answer, the structure is clear to him. Subconsciously, he knows the structure of your answer, right? So you are convincing him that you have written well. So clearly the 4 points that you mentioned here, internal urge and direct environment and desire, use and disuse, inheritance. One better way to present here is the using the flow chart I was showing in the class. That can definitely make it the presentation bit more better. But otherwise, these 4 points are important and the examples you clearly explained, I think concisely explained. Conciseness is another important thing. I've seen one of you that I mentioned to you, you are actually writing too much for an answer. You will not have that much of time and space in the exam. I even remember talking to some of the old students, they said they were penalized for writing too much in the UPSC exams sometimes. So don't aim to write too much. Too much is not actually, too quantity is probably not preferable here because you're losing time. You may not answer all the questions. So what I want you to do is learn to make it concise, which requires practice and analysis. I don't expect you to listen to my class and right away start answering great things. No, it won't happen. On your side, you actually have to think multiple times, what is this concept? I only have so much of space and exams are opportunity for you. Because if you're talking about a 10 marker question, I was talking about 150 words, 1.5 page. About aim at 1.5 page, maybe maximum 2 pages, 2 sides of the page. Don't try to write 3 pages, 3.5 pages. That shows the examiner that you don't have control on the information here. And writing too much doesn't help. Writing concisely, maybe with a diagram or something like this, if you explain concisely why giraffes had to put, why the need for stretching their heads had come, what was the situation, and eventually what had happened as per the Lamarckian theory. So concisely you have to explain. So think about what are the key points, what should be your choice of words here. Okay, and try to put a bit more scientific. You don't have to stress too much. Don't be too generalistic. Don't be too scientific. You have to be somewhere in between where you are using scientific terms appropriately and while explaining it as people can follow it. So that balance comes with practice. So this is a beginning. You are at the beginning of this process and it's the first test. So this is all right, but understand and try to address the problems. You all have specific issues in your writing. Okay, so focus on those issues that you have. Next time when you're writing, keep them in mind. Okay, I want to write more concise answers. I want to limit to this stuff, this amount of space. So tell it to yourself. So then you are actually avoiding the mistakes in the answers. And of course, second time I'm not expecting you to completely, do it the best, but gradually you work on it. But I want to see the improvement in the way you're writing answers in the next test. Okay, this is psychological more than the information. What do you want? You have to know your expectations from each question. So the demand of the question, I think I clearly told you this should be the part. Vishal, you also did well on many of these questions. So Lamarckism, I think you're also brief enough and concise. But only thing is I've seen a bit of a repetition in these parts here. So you describe the 4 principles, you explain the same principles, which took the space here, right? So instead of listing them, I already discussed that here, right? So that is sufficient. If you expand on this, this is sufficient because otherwise these 4 points plus this flowchart is not giving any new information. They're both carrying same information, correct? So avoid it. Otherwise, overall structure-wise, I've found it good. You also provided criticism towards the end. So these aspects of writing is good. Okay. So Sunil, I think as I was telling you, I'll point out a few things here and then I think we'll generalize rest of the answers. So your way of approach for this question may not be suitable. So you did the postulate one and criticism. This is good when they ask for something critical. Then this type of approach, critically discuss Lamarckism, this type of approach may be useful. Otherwise, briefly describe what is Lamarckism, show the flow chart I was talking about. That is more useful. That is why you actually lost marks on this. I could not give you enough marks, and you didn't discuss the example as well. Okay, these are the common mistakes students make with respect to that. Okay, and Shweta, you are actually writing a bit more. I think in terms of space issue, that is what I have seen with you. Your overall presentation is good, but you are discussing a bit too much. You will not have time for that. Shweta, are you there in the class?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so focus on making it more concise.
Yes, sir.
Okay, otherwise your handwriting is neat. You are actually presenting with images where possible. But only thing is, as I was saying, you club them. You don't have space for writing images like this. Show them in single image. Practice drawing images, and especially they are important for the fossils part for us. Okay, so they will provide you some clues on how to draw things. But otherwise, I think example you have written well. But only thing is, I felt you're writing too much, and you will not have time for that. And too much of description on criticism is also not useful. So I've given a clear instructions on what to do here. Okay, right. That is about the first question. So we'll follow the same approach, same trend. I'll give you the structure here. Second question, the B is adaptive radiation. So adaptive radiation, basically give definition. What does it mean by adaptive radiation? And most importantly, you explain it with examples. You can take Darwin finches as examples because most of this is focused on that. But if you want more human relevant, take the example of mammals. I'm going to provide you the structure to you. So image like this is useful, simple image like this. I think I've seen some of you have drawn images. I think most of you have drawn images with the Darwin finches. If you want something, an idea on mammalian side, take this. Like terrestrial insectivores, for example, later became to diversified into these type of varieties of mammals. Those walking, those running ones, burrowing ones, flying ones. Give the list of the diversity. And radiation, adaptive radiation is the way radiation spreads to all directions. The species have actually moved into different directions. This is what the core theme here. So talk about that adaptive radiation concept here. Okay, with an example like this. So this is very important. So the structure should definitely focus on this. What is adaptive radiation? And explain the adaptive radiation with examples. So Darwin finches and mammals, you can explain both, you can take both, but emphasize more on one of them.
Sir, here, instead of the, say, images of the animals, can we use box diagrams? Just say, write the name of the animal.
Yeah, of course. You don't have to draw the animals. I think it will take too much of time for us. And especially drawing something that is actually understandable to others is difficult, right? Unless you're used to. So you don't have to draw the diagrams. Boxes, names, running herbivore, burrowing type of organisms, walking ones, swimming ones, like variety, show the variety. You can even include humans, bipedals, right? You can include the humans, how we actually got, either you can write primates or humans as part of the primates, you can say hanging arboreal versions. You can write even humans who are able to walk, right? So just the idea is to show that adaptive radiation is taking place, enough diversity is created, new species are formed from the common ancestor. And what is the most important thing is the need. Here, the new environment, their need, they adapted differently to survive better. Finches specify that their food is what actually driving force here for defining their nose shape or the beak shape. So those key points have to be highlighted for sure. Okay, and I don't want you to write specific theories here. I don't want you to write speciation methods. I think if I'm not wrong, Shweta, you talked about theories, different theories. Don't talk about theories here. Okay, so different speciation methods are not relevant here. Divergent evolution, if you want to talk about divergent evolution as part of it, is all right. Okay, but I want the structure should be like this. Look into the specific comments I made. If any of those comments are unclear to you, do let me know. I'll try to explain you, or even if possible, I can give you a quick call. We can discuss that.
Yes, sir.
Okay, but that's all right now. So like if you have made mistake, that's all right. I think making mistakes is not wrong. Correcting is what is important. And I think the whole purpose of these tests is this is not a test series program. This is a classwork program where you're just practicing how you are presenting information. So that tells me how well you understood. And I was really happy that the information that you have written here is very, very relevant. I could clearly feel that you could comprehend what we talked about in the class, but you have to work on practicing, presenting information. Otherwise, I think I could feel that for the first time, that because I don't know, normally I don't have other way of knowing how much you are following it. I could clearly see that you are writing relevant information, relevant examples. I think once here and there, I think Yash is not there in the group. He actually made a bit of mistake in choosing what examples to give. Okay. Otherwise, I found that you're able to actually write answers well. So one thing I would like to ask here. So were you actually following the content that is given to your understanding? Were you also referring to other materials? Any of you who have gone outside the materials and wrote information here? So were you sticking to the content that is given to you? And nothing wrong. I actually, if you prefer, I prefer indeed that you finish reading the content and pick up examples from other sources. Nothing wrong in it. If you're able to do that, add diversity, that's great. Because sometimes in test series programs, I happen to read the content from students who are trained by other teachers. They may pick up different examples, which is completely all right. But make sure that we are talking about something more standard in the field and give value addition to that, rather than just going with something that is entirely different. Okay.
I tried looking at other materials,
Right.
but I found it very, say, too much in detail compared to what we have. Ours is more precise and found it to the point to even replicate it here. But when I tried looking at the other material, there is a bit more information. Probably I didn't find it more useful in the context of this test.
Good to hear that, because one thing I always have in my mind is I don't want to dump too much things. Okay, of course, it's an ongoing process. Some topics I may not do the justice like that, but I prefer to have information clear to you and precisely given to you. But the problem with that type of information is you need explanation. So that is why this type of information goes well hand in hand with my class explanation and the content. If I give the same content to you without explanation, this may be difficult. So the material that you probably are talking about, where you can read and work on it and then concise yourself, such material is also there in the market. And sometimes teachers preferably do that because they don't want students to just get everything from the content. It's purposefully done sometimes. But good to hear that it is concise enough for you to follow. Okay.
And
right.
even compared to the other material, the IGNO material that you had shared is more, I found it more insightful, especially for that synthetic theory question.
Synthetic theory of evolution, they have given a nice description on this current. I have also taken some points from there. Right. That is why, where possible, IGNO has material for most of the things, but I'm not sharing it for every topic because some topics have done a good job. So where they are actually preferable, I'm sharing that material. So I'm selective in. That's why we're actually working on multiple sources. Stein, we're working on Ember and Ember. We're working on IGNO's material, some genetic resources online. So we're trying to combine information from different sources. That is one aim. And in my teaching is to bring the diversity to your information rather than just everyone reading same books, giving same examples, writing same information. I don't think you will stand out in the exam from that point of view. Okay, right. So next question is Dolo's rule. Dolo's rule is straightforward. I think in the handout that is given to you, I've clearly defined it. So what is Dolo's rule? Law of irreversibility you talk about. And one thing I've seen, the way you explain it is where people are difficulty, I found. So definition explained with an example. So you take an example of how Dolo's rule says that it is statistically improbable to have same structure, same component made. Meaning if from A to B a structure is formed, a species is formed, it cannot directly like A, B, C, D, it went on. It cannot necessarily to go back to C and go back to B in the same order. So statistically, we're talking about improbability of becoming or reaching back to the same part. But we are not talking about forming the same organ. Same organs may be formed. Like we talked about, I think few aspects of, the wings, for example, serve the different purpose, but they happen to form at different stages of evolution. This might happen, right? Same structures, we are not saying the same structures won't form. We are saying that statistically going back in the same process, reverting back to the same organism, ancestral organism is not possible. Statistically, it is not possible. It is not impossible. I'm saying it is improbable. I think one of you have used the term impossible. I don't think impossible is the right term. It is improbable. So it is practically not possible, but we cannot say impossible. It may. Even in the same environment, if you are, we talked about in today's class, people adapt differently. So you may not expect exactly the same change. But we talked about gliders, same environment, but in different countries. They may adapt to the same shapes. So all these are possible. But here they're talking about irreversibility. Irreversibility is may not be possible statistically. talk about interpretations given by Gould and other people, because there is not too much of information on this topic. That is why I gave, while reading a couple of sources in the literature, I gave few points, that extra points that you can write. Focus on them, but most importantly, define what is Dolus Ra, explain with examples. I think I'll give you one of you, I think Preeti or Vishal, I forgot who did that. You explained them nicely with respect to the how these components actually should not be mistaken with not forming an organ. Okay, a structure that changes its form in evolution will not revert to the earlier form irreversibly. Okay, this is a descriptive generalization. So they're trying to generalize it, but they're talking about statistical improbability here. It is not law of nature, and one must realize that it is the property of the living organisms. So this point, these type of explanations are very, very important. Okay, and you have also taken good examples here. Primate evolution, that basically we can notice that ancestral or descendant status with respect to the given forms, you cannot exactly get back to that complete status. But things may happen. Things may happen in the evolution. You may find the same thing. An example of flying reptiles, for example. Reptiles have become extinct. The wings and adaptations to an airborne way of life had already again started. Okay, so you may see that reappearance of the same component. Okay, so that does happen, right? I also, I think, gave one example in the handout related to that as well. You can give that, but I think using terms like statistical improbability are important. So I mentioned it here because you've not used a term like that, but you're referring to the same concept. So sometimes terminology, they're looking for certain specific terms. Make sure that you are addressing them. Okay, right. Otherwise, the handout that is given to you is very well useful to you.
Sir, I have drawn a couple of images. Can you suggest which is the better way?
Sure. So you're talking about for this question, right?
For Dolo, yeah.
So I gave interpretations of Richard Hawkins and Stephen Gould. Yeah. I think I think this bottom flowchart is sufficient, because one thing is sometimes to present a particular organism, you actually have to work on, right? It is not necessary to draw the diagram of that, but a flowchart like this is enough. So that is why I've just put the tick here. So this is not necessary. This part is not necessary. Okay, the one at the bottom is all right. So trying to explain that if something goes from reptiles to common ancestors to the other forms, which is more likely, which is less likely, right? So this is something like this is sufficient. Okay, next moving on to the consanguineous marriages. I think consanguineous marriages, define what are they, more or less your definitions you got, right? So second cousins and closer than second cousins you mentioned about. Then I think look into the content. I've given a very good amount of content for consanguineous marriages. In the classes also I've provided you statistics on this. So use them. Like overall geographically and religion wise, how consanguineous marriages rate is changing. Some of you have mentioned that certain religious communities, I think it's more common. Also, I want you to talk about case studies like the one I've given to you, born in Bradford study. Mention about that. This is one of the great amount of study that has been done related to consanguineous marriages. If you want, even in southern India, that we have studies, but they are quality wise, they're actually a bit more inferior, I felt. Otherwise, in Andhra Pradesh, they have done studies in particular castes. Okay, how consanguineous marriage is more common in certain castes. But more than that, I feel something like born in Bradford is well-known study. Mention about that. But if you want, even such studies are there. I can even share the articles with you on that. And also, I wanted to focus on factors and advantages. Some of you did, but some of you didn't focus much on the factors. What are the advantages we discussed? Why consanguineous marriages are more common in some of these communities? Okay, so financial advantages, ties that they have with the families, those type of components are important. And most importantly, I want to talk about and highlight the issues with consanguineous marriages. Increased homozygosity, increased disease burden rate, rare disease burdens actually increases. Decreased heterozygosity, that also has a problem because hybrid vigor, they normally say heterozygosity is more reproductively useful than the homozygosity. Right? Talk about those aspects, how disease burden rate can increase in given areas with consanguineous marriage. So there's enough diversity. When you're talking about short notes, when they don't give exact context in which they want you to discuss, focus on describing them like this. Okay, give enough diversity in your answer. Definition, rates, any case studies like components, religion-wise, geographically. Show diagrams, pie charts that I have shown in the class. You can draw those type of things. Okay, and discuss about the factors and issues. You are adding enough diversity to the answer because it's generalized question. They're not asking you what are the negative effects or impacts of consanguineous marriages. Then you don't talk too much about it. You answer it differently. There also you can talk about case study, but discuss the issues. As part of the issues, you show the case study. So this case study has clearly shown that in Pakistanis living in UK, they have a higher disease burden rate because of practice like this. So then you're highlighting the issue and explaining it with an example or a case study. Right? So your answer structure should look different depending on the demand of the question. This comes only when you have better understanding about the topic. Okay, right. So that is about consanguineous marriages. And then look, genetic load. Genetic load is straightforward. We have certain defined elements in the genetic load that you have to write. Describe what is genetic load, what are the different types of genetic loads briefly, and how genetic load is calculated. So these are 3 points that I wanted to write. Okay, some of you missed writing about calculation part. Brief, you don't have to give description. Show the formula. What is optimal genotype? What is average genotype? How do you get the ratio for this? If you want, you mention that. What is a scenario for the 100% load and what is scenario for the 0%? If you want, you can mention that. Otherwise, there are enough types. Don't just talk about 2 to 3 types. Let's say you don't have space. Instead of just talking about 3 types, talk about them. Mention the others. Don't leave them. I think we talked about 5 to 6 different types of genetic loads. Okay, if you want to talk in detail about 3 of them, but mention the other 2 or 3, that's all right. But don't leave them. Mention them. At least mention them. That load can also happen through the incompatibility, segregation. I think some of you actually, I forgot who it is. And I don't want to mention that as well. That one of you actually have misunderstood the types. Segregation load, those type of things, understand it well. Okay, read again, and if you have still difficulty, do ask me, I'll explain that again. Okay, right. So this is a genetic load part. So those, I think a maximum are given 5 marks. If you have got 5 marks or 4.5. 4.5 meaning somewhere presentation is missing, otherwise your content is right. If you only got 2 to 3 marks like that, then definitely you're missing some key components from the answer. Explained. Okay, next second question. Discuss how synthetic theory of evolution integrated the fields of genetics and evolution. Yes, I definitely feel that some of you had a difficulty in answering this question. I think this is what we need to prepare for the current anthropology exams, because they are making it a bit less straightforward than what it used to be. More analytical preparation is very much needed to do well in the exams. This time, many students who wrote the exam, those who didn't prepare holistically, who prepared question answer, they struggled answering well in this mains exam. And those people who actually prepared well analytically, they have written well because they had that self-satisfaction that the analysis they have done for preparation had worked out. So exam is becoming a bit tough in a sense that they're actually giving in a different dimensions to the questions. For that, you have to have a bit of analysis done beforehand. So this is one such question. Synthetic theory of evolution integrated in the fields of genetics and evolution. First start with the synthetic theory. First explain what is synthetic theory. Then define synthetic theory. Then you talk about, next focus should be on the traditional theories, Lamarckism, not too much on the Lamarckism. I wanted to focus mostly on the Darwinism and neo-Darwinism. You can make a mention, but don't try to explain in a paragraph what is Lamarckism. You say in continuation with the Lamarckism, where we thought somatic characteristics happen, changes happen in the somatic characteristics, then the understanding the value of natural selection and variation given by Darwin's theory is important. Then you say there are shortcomings in the Darwin's theory. Darwin could not explain at the molecular level what is happening and what was being selected by the nature. So for this, you have to add, remember, they're asking about integrating the field of genetics. You're focused mostly on the genetic component, plus of course, molecular theories are also important here. Mention those scientists who contributed. I've given 4 or 5 scientists names and they briefly mention about they contributed greatly to this. But what ideas are important here? Darwinism could tell us natural selection is acting on the variation, but it could not tell the nature of the variation. Where is this variation coming from? And how natural selection is acting on it was not explained at the molecular level. So your next part is integration part. What areas of the genetics went together with the Darwin's explanation to give us the new form of synthetic theory, new form of the theory called synthetic theory or neo-Darwinian theory. So here, I think some of you have written very well. What are the sources of variation? How variations happen? Talk about various sources of variation. Talk about the variation coming from the mutation, recombination, right? And there's enough diversity in the population level. It's not at the individual level. Population has enough raw material that natural selection can act on. Talk about natural selection briefly if you can spend time. Talk about types of natural selection. I think one of you briefly mentioned even types of them. I think two of you have mentioned that. That is good if you are able to manage time. But what I'm expecting here, briefly talk about what is traditional theory of evolution, mainly Darwinian theory of evolution, how modern understanding through genetic studies, like even population genetics you can mention here. I think one of you have mentioned that, like a study of genetic equilibrium. That is also providing a new way of looking at the how evolution is taking place, how various factors are playing a role here. So you have to have that information put together. There are many ways that you can write this answer, but most importantly, I wanted to write about Darwinian theory, how synthetic theory helped us understand better the Darwinian theory, and what aspects have been integrated from the genetics point of view. Knowing the DNA, we got to know about DNA, we got to know about nature of mutations, we got to know about recombination, we got to know about the genetic drift, population genetics part. Add these components that you studied in various other units. But collective idea provided us a better picture about evolution with factual data. Who proposed this information? Writing factual data on that. The problem, what I've seen is sometimes you miss the order. Probably I've discussed too much about Darwinism, Lamarckism, and missed on writing enough about the genetics role. And also terms. In this manner, genetics have provided enough clues about how evolution takes place. Conclusion part should have emphasis on what they're asking, the tone, in the tone that they're actually using here. This is how genetics has played an important role through synthetic theory of evolution in understanding this. You have to have those type of conclusions in this type of analytical questions. And don't try to write, I think, so who did that? One of you have written more on the Mendel laws. I don't want you to focus too much on the Mendel laws. Mention about them. Don't describe law of segregation. Don't describe law of independence, Hardman. Mention that the information that is provided by Gregor Mendel has provided idea about the inheritance. And then, the idea about the mutations, idea about the existence of genes, which even Mendel could not explain. Ideas are important here rather than specifics. Okay, right. So this is how I think you have to write it. If you want, have a look at one of you, I think in this case again. Preeti, I think you have done well again on this. Preeti, more or less, I think you nailed the answers well. So have a look at her answers just to get an idea. So, and even the description I have given to you, or even IGNO's material nicely describes this part. So you also have a given idea, important theories, Lamarckism, Darwinism, and Dewey's theory. Then in synthetic theory concepts, you have clearly written, explain it very well. Production and variation, how is variation created as a subheading you have written? Where is the genetic variation coming from? And how natural selection is acting on the variation. I think one of you, I think Vishal probably used the image that I've used in the mutations part, I've shown in the mutations part, how mutations are created, how natural selection acts on it. Such diagrams are also useful here, if you can manage the time well.
I don't think I've written this question correctly, but I thought we should write a bit more on the
Yes.
how evolution and genetics were firstly.
But genetics here not just refers to the Mendelian part. Genetics refers to much more than Mendel. Mendel is key, definitely. Talk about Mendelian version, that he provided inheritance principles briefly. Don't have to describe them. Then also talk about more on the sources of variation. That is the key point here. I think if I'm not wrong, you've drawn an image for this.
In a different question.
In a different question. I think that question can be written here, how natural selection is acting on the variation. When that is useful diagram for this. If you really understood the concept, you can pick up examples from different topics. You can pick up images from different topics. That is also possible. Okay, right. Next. What is Ardevin-Bugler? This is straightforward. I've given the content to you, explained it in the class. So straightforward question and a well-repeated question in the exam. So first of all, they're asking what is Ardevin-Bugler? State the Ardevin-Bugler. Gene and genotypic frequencies don't change in the large randomly mating populations in absence of evolutionary factors. State that and mention who proposed this law. as well. That factual data, some extent is enough, is needed here. So state the law, and very important is assumptions. Right under what assumptions does it work? One mistake I have seen that students, just like the other example I talked to you about, you are repeating the same information, assumptions and factors. Assumptions have to be just very, very brief. So under either you put it under the state of the law, but we're talking about 20 marker questions. You have enough room. So you're writing on the 4 sides of the page. You have enough room for writing the answers. So what you do here, briefly state the assumptions, mention the assumptions. Under these assumptions it works. And then factors, discuss the factors in detail. If you want, put the formula before. You don't have to put the formula here. It's up to you. There are a few ways that you can work on it. So explain the law, give the formula, and I think most of you have done well. Explain the formulas, and also briefly mentioned dominant characteristics, recessive characteristics, homozygous condition, heterozygous condition, how the formula should look like. That is all right. And assumptions. Okay, and where possible, you discuss the factors. If you want here, you can mention the significance, why this is useful. Hardy-Weinberg law provides us the basis for us to see how evolution is taking place and the directionality at which evolution is happening. Some of you have really written well on those things. And plus, what I have noticed is, in addition to that, I mention about the disease burden rate. Carrier burden rate can be calculated using this. Okay, I briefly explained this question in one of our YouTube videos. If you want, watch that. And then factors. The factors should, there should be more focus on the factors part. The factors should be at least 1.5 page to 2 sides of the page information. Describe each factor. Some of you have done well, each factor, and some of you even shown me the images there, like how different factors like isolation, migration, genetic drift. Okay, and understand, I think one of you had made a mistake of discussed genetic drift separately from the founder's effect. They both are connected to each other. Okay, discuss them as well together, but the answers should be straightforward. State the law, who presented it, basic formula for that, under what assumption does it work, and what are the factors that affect it. So if you have a page and a half discussion on the first part, factors should take the rest of the part. So factors should be the most majority of the focus here. That's how you have to balance the answer. Otherwise, how much ever you write, you won't get the marks correctly, because the balance as per the demand of the question is very, very important. Okay, right. Next one. Not sure if whose question was that? Not sure one of you have written this question well. Have a look at others, okay, just to see a picture of it. Yeah. Right, so this is Preeti's one. I think you've done well here. What is the law, the main law? What does it state? And then conditions under which it is true, and equation. Applications also mentioned, that is all right. Limitations, don't have to focus too much on limitations part, but focus more on the factors part. Non-random mating, assortative mating, consanguinity, mutations, selection, genetic drift. I think you are the one to discuss genetic drift separately, right? So founder's effect, put it under the genetic drift. Okay, and gene flow, like that. Okay, so this structure should be all right for this question. And the next one is, the last one is a balanced genetic polymorphism. I think this, I felt students have struggled to explain how this is maintained. Right, so first define what is balanced genetic polymorphism, and your focus should be on the heterozygote advantage, how heterozygotes are maintained. So in the example, so take the example, standard example of sickle cell anemia you can take here, but briefly talk about the diseases. Malaria, what type of disease is malaria? That is how I actually even taught in the class as well, keeping this in mind. So malaria, explain about malaria, explain about the sickle cell anemia. Right, and once you introduce the problem of malaria, both are connected in one common way. Both are connected to RBCs. Malarial parasite survives in the RBC, and sickle cell anemia has something to do with the shape of the RBC. So there's definitely some common component here. Okay, so here what happens with respect to this common component, explain both of them. If you remember it right, I think the article I've shared with you, and the genetic polymorphism, balanced genetic polymorphism, explain them. How, and you show the numbers in Africa, how the percentage of incidence of sickle cell anemia is high compared to the other populations. overlap between the malarial region and the sickle cell anemia regions, which I think most of you have done that. That images are very, very useful here, but explain how this pool is maintained, genetic pool is maintained, because mutations that are favorable, because people with sickle cell anemic condition, they were actually resistant to malaria. So because it is provided at selective advantage, heterozygote condition is maintained, because either cases, if you have two smallest or sickle cell anemic conditions, it is deadly. So that is not useful. So you show them as a equation if you want, either having two capital S and two smallest. So both of them are disadvantages. Capital S makes more prone to malaria. Smallest makes more prone to sickle cell anemia. Something in between heterozygous condition, capital S is more useful. And this is what is noticeable in certain populations. What percentage of increase have you noticed? The statistics you mentioned. Show the overlap in the populations. Describe this is how it is maintained because of the usefulness of the heterozygous condition over the either of the conditions. So your explanation should follow this type of order. Then you are able to do justice to how it is maintained in a given population. In the end, if you want, this is not just limited to sickle cell anemia. Many such examples exist. You mentioned about the other disease, other examples I talked about in the class. The chloride channel mutation, cystic fibrosis, those type of components you can mention. Okay, so use this source I have provided you. I think one textbook page I have provided to you on this, correct? Louis Human Genetics. So read this. They have described this process. Okay, this component I've given you for additional reading. Use the sickle cell disease and malaria. Briefly explain malaria, briefly explain sickle cell anemia, and then talk about how this is maintained, a protective effect, how this is felt, how studies are clearly showing that effect. Okay, show this type of diagram and explain it. Okay.
Sir, in this question, I was not able to write more than 2 pages, but that too, with the help of case study, I was able to fill. But
Right.
For the concept, what else could I include, sir? As in,
Concept wise, there's not much here. Concept wise, the information is limited, but the only thing is to satisfy the requirement of it. I think what you have written here, you explained what is balanced polymorphism. You also mentioned transient polymorphism briefly. That's all right. What is the balancing agent is natural selection. Both dominant recessive characteristics are maintained, so heterozygotes are maintained. Sickle cell disease, you showed the shape of the sickle cell disease. Have you described the diseases briefly? So that is something missing here, right? So briefly introduce about the diseases. What is a common theme for them that you have to write? Blood vessels, I think you've written that here anyway. This part, but in the view that they both are connected to the RBCs. So you have also provided the ratios here. So one thing, yeah, I think you also explained the disease as well here. Common theme. Okay, one thing that I could see here is how heterozygous condition is maintained between them. So when you introduce both of these diseases, even before introducing this concept here, if you want, show sickle cell anemia condition and normal condition, how the heterozygotes are at higher advantages to this. So a bit of explanation is required. Otherwise, I think all the components are there in your answer. This is 15 marker, right? So you could actually have to shell out more. You need more space, about another half a page information that you can write here. I think all the core elements are there, no doubt. I think only thing, only explanation that you may require here with respect to this is adding the bit of more explanation between the maintenance of the heterozygous conditions. That is the only thing I can see here. Otherwise, core concept is clear. And as far as sometimes you have all the elements, let's say that you didn't have to maintain exactly, let's say 2.5 pages. You have all the elements correctly filled. That's all right, because some of you can write more concisely and you have elements like the diagrams are there, examples are there, explanation is there. That is enough, that is sufficient. You don't lose too many marks because you didn't use enough space. They're not too much worried about the space. On average, you have to handle the space. For some questions, you may use less space. For some questions, you may use a bit more space. But overall, your information has to be balanced. Don't overdo it. Half a page here and there, extra or less is all right. So I don't feel that you need much more for this answer. Okay. But if you want an additional idea, give it a read on this unit, this pages I've sent you on balanced polymorphism. Okay. Right. Any other questions, guys, that you want to ask? Is this information clear enough for you to see where you are lagging behind and how answers should be structure-wise? Okay, read the specific points that I've given to you, and if my explanation you didn't specifically mention what mistakes you have done, do ask me. I'll help you understand what I really meant there. Okay, right. That was good. So good for today. I think we finished talking about this. Tomorrow I'm going to send the question paper as usual. Okay, keep in mind this instructions I've provided you today. So follow those, and try to incorporate these changes in your answers. Good. Should we end the session here? I'm going to send you the content for today. This 9.7 I've not sent you, and few things I want to add for reading for the previous chapter as well, which I'm going to send you by tomorrow. Okay, but focus on the test for now. And I think we're going to have class at the same time as usual from Monday onwards. Right? Whenever if there is additional class, Sir is going to mention to me, we're going to take the class in the morning. Okay, otherwise we're going to stick to our usual timings. Good. Okay. Right then. So have a good weekend and prepare well for the exam. I'll post the questions by 9 o'clock in the morning. Okay, right.
Thank you, sir.
You're welcome.